I'm Kenneth Cukier. I'm a senior editor at The Economist, and I've written books about data. And I'm talking to you today about contact tracing and privacy and society. Now, it is a very tricky question because you would think that the world would have been able to balance both public health and individual privacy. But alas, no, that wasn't the case. We weren't able to do that. And I think it's been a real tragedy that we haven't been able to have it both ways, so to speak. So that's what I'd like to talk to you today about, and to think about how we might be able to do better and start a conversation on how we might be able to do better as a society. 3/11 is going to be considered a very important day in history, like 9/11 was. But 3/11 was the day that the World Health Organization declared COVID as as a pandemic. And at the time, if you remember, there was actually a lot of optimism that, amid the despair, that we could apply the track and trace systems and testing for us to get a handle on what was going on and to fight back. And we could actually use technology, first and foremost, to do that. Because on a digital setting, we could do things that we couldn't otherwise do. And all you have to do is think back in history about what it would be like to have a plague in the Middle Ages, where all you were able to do was isolate the sufferers and in effect watch them die. And then later on, the great project of the 19th century and early 20th century was about applying our reason and our organization and our thoughtfulness to actually control the situation. And the way we do that is through tracking and tracing. What we would do is we would apply simply identify who has it, then their contacts who was exposed to it, and isolate them from the population. And over time, the reproductive rate of the contagion of the plague, of the pandemic, actually subsides because fewer people are getting infected. And the R naught, as we call it today, gets lower and lower until eventually we can extinguish the pandemic. And we can do that now on digital tools that are more sophisticated, like call data records, in which we can use where the phone is and maybe the calls that it's made and who they're contacting, but more importantly, where they are through the geolocation services or simple triangulation from the cell phone tower, in order to identify where the caller is and therefore where the prevalence of the pandemic may be and may be going. This was used in a very rudimentary sense during the Ebola pandemic in West Africa several years ago, in 2014, but only in a rudimentary way. I mean, you would think that in 2020, we could do it in a more sophisticated way in top-tier economies. And so you would think that, but you'd be wrong, actually. And the reason why is, although we have this possibility for testing, tracking, and tracing, we didn't either have the creativity, and we certainly didn't have the policy and institutional framework in order to enable it. So let's first look at the first part of that, tracking, which is going to be also the most controversial. And so if you just open your mind to what was possible on a digital setting with the handset of the mobile phone, it's pretty extraordinary. You'd be able to know, and this is just in theory, you'd be able to know first the location of a person. You'd also be able to know their movements. You would know not just their movements, but others in their vicinity. You'd have their address book, so you'd know who their contacts are. And you would know the duration of any interaction with people, and also even the type of interaction. Are they on a train together, or are they in a car? Because you'd know where they're going. You'd see that they're going at a certain speed. You'd know that interaction, they could have been walking or together. These are the sorts of things, or maybe they could actually have, the phones could have been in the same vicinity, the same apartment overnight, suggesting that they may have stayed in the same vicinity that evening together. These are the sorts of things that are possible to know on a track and trace system. You would even know, in fact, if it's the first time those two phones have been in the same apartment together. And there's a reason why society didn't actually implement all of the bounty of digital possibilities using data, and it's because of this. It's because that when similar situations in the past were put forward where data could be applied in the most ugliest of ways, it was. This is Marseille, In France, this is the year 1943, and this is the roundup of the Jews of Marseille in 1943. You can see children in the foreground of the image, and there you'll see a boy who's probably about 10 years old, and another one next to a mother who's about 7. And my father was a 5-hour car ride away from there in Montluçon, and he was about 7. So I feel skin in the game about this issue. I'm animated about it. The countries that had the most complete civil records also had the worst atrocities in terms of the roundup and extermination of Jews, suggesting a link between the richness of the data and it being used for the most blood-soaked ends. So we have to be very careful about how we look at this and realize that it also isn't this historical artifact of Nazis in Europe. America, on a very, very, very different level, extraordinarily different level, still nevertheless use data for their purposes, which they felt was legitimate at the time, for the internment of the Japanese. And we can't even think that this is somehow lost into the sands of time, into the past. It's only a century ago, which our great grandparents are, fight, not ours, because it was in our own living memory just 25 years ago that the data and civil records of a country were used to kill other people, in this case in Rwanda. Now, if that's the tracking part of it, that's the potential that we have. The tracing actually is interesting and sort of almost answers that, because we can, on a digital setting, we could actually use the technology to render all this data anonymous, to make all this data private, and we can have these automated notifications so that you would think that you don't even need sort of a central authority. You do need a central authority in certain choke points, but in other domains, you don't, to actually run the system and to actually enable it to work, as opposed to a century ago in which you had contact tracers, or even today, human beings calling people using ledgers, identifying it and writing things down and being able to look at it with their eyes and communicate it to other people. It gets even more interesting, and also maybe horrific as well, depending on your state of mind, if you think about the first T, the testing part of it. With the data that we have, we could actually test some of our assumptions, not just have the testing data that people would upload into the app or that we can infer whether they have COVID or not. And we could learn new information about the spread of the pandemic. So for example, we have this rule, the 2-meter rule, that if you're farther than 2 meters, you're probably safe, and you're within 2 meters, you shouldn't be. Well, how do we know that? Well, we have some studies, but they're not very robust studies. We could actually test that if we understood who had COVID and who didn't, and then who came down with COVID later, and the vicinities of their cell phones. We could learn new things. 15 minutes of exposure, the exposure notification apps rely on 15 minutes of contact. Why isn't it 10? Why isn't it 20? Well, that's an assumption that we've built in. There is a little bit of science behind it, but not a whole lot. And if we actually could use the data, we could learn new things about the spread of the disease that would actually help us. It gets even trickier and maybe even a little bit more questionable when you think about other things that we could do. So for example, if someone's cell phone use dramatically changes, that either they're not answering the phone as quickly as they used to, the conversations are far shorter than ever before, that they're not actually scrolling in quite the same way, but looking at things maybe just for the time and that's it, that maybe there's been a variable that's intervened, maybe they're ill, and we might be able to infer that this is a telltale pattern of illness. There has been research at MIT several years ago that did show for the common flu that there was changes in the pattern of cell phone usage that was a telltale that the person was coming down with and then subsequently was infected with the seasonal flu. Could get even more spooky when the person's talking. If they have the dry cough, we would be able to, an algorithm could pick that up fairly easily. In fact, we could, as we know from the Snowden disclosures, we can even activate the microphone without the person knowing, and we could actually listen into conversations a little bit like Alexa, or just simply use Alexa if we wanted to through that means, and know if someone had a dry cough and know, and therefore infer whether they had COVID or not. And again, this is possible. We can use data this way, and we're not using data this way. And the reason why is that we feel that this is a abuse of power from the country, from the state, to the citizen and that we should be wary of it. And we have legitimate reasons to be wary of it. There are times when the state has done incredibly heinous things that we have to be open-eyed about and recognize that that's in our nature and it's possible, and we have laws to govern against it, and they're imperfect. Now, this is also maybe in some domains, for some people, this is very, if you're in a developing country and an embryonic democracy, this is a very real problem. If you're in a Western country with the rule of law, it's less of a real problem, and I'm going to bring this up in a moment. But amid testing and track and trace, we also have technology, and most of you at the conference for the next 2 days have been thinking simply about that, and because you're coders and developers and technologists, and that's what your expertise is. And so all of these technologies are abundant, and I've named a few, that we can apply to this problem and are trying to, but largely haven't, because we haven't been using the technology for all that we could. And part of the reason is that the law isn't there to help us, enable us to do that. We have GDPR, we've got HIPAA in the US, and other countries have their own privacy legislation built generally around the OECD guidelines. But again, the testing is happening in a difficult way for most places where there's just not been enough of it. And we'll leave that aside. We're not making inferences around testing, and maybe we shouldn't because that's too early a science. But the track and trace hasn't been happening either. Instead, what we have are notification apps, exposure notification apps that are simply letting you know if you've been in the vicinity of someone who has tested positive for COVID. And the way it works is very simple. The cell phones through Bluetooth are able to send a little messages to each other that they've been in contact, and then they measure how long it's been, typically 15 minutes. And then if they've been in that proximity of each other and someone comes down with COVID, the others are automatically notified. But the data is decentralized, and in fact, there is no data. It stays on the handset. It doesn't go anywhere else, and then it gets erased, and the apps can be disabled when the pandemic's over and can't be reused for nefarious purposes. And you have to be certified in order to get the API to use it. And all of these things seem very good. In fact, it's clearly people at Apple and Google that cooperated to launch this that recognized that this was such an urgent issue that they had to act, that they had this infrastructure that could actually play a hugely important role. But because they know data so well, so much better than everyone else, they understood the ways which it could be misused. And so they felt that it was critical that they actually deployed this with the highest level of privacy safeguard possible. In fact, so high that it seems like they wanted to make sure that they didn't look like they were not protecting privacy, that because if they showed as a wisp of anti-privacy, they'll be pummeled by consumers, and they'll be pummeled by the stock market. But maybe they were a little bit too careful, because a lot of countries, the rightful sovereign and legitimate leaders, feel like this has been a problem for them. And a person just thinking about this with an open set of eyes would say, really? Like, no data? These guys? To the state? Really? Like, I don't know about this. No data. Well, let's think about what a country automatically has on citizens. They know your name. You need a birth certificate. They know if you have people in the family, either through the census, which is, of course, cordoned off, or should be, but through other ways, in which if you have a driver's license or if you have voting records, they know your home address, work, and your income through the tax records. They know if you've bought property. They know if you've had any judicial problems. They know your health if you have a national health service. And the companies, of course, their business model is data. So, of course, they know who you are, certainly your email address if they're offering you free email. They know your home and your work if you have a cell phone or you're working, because they know where it's staying during either business hours or in the evenings. They often will know your spending. They'll certainly know your interests if you're Googling it. They may know who your partners are if your phones are next to each other overnight. And they may know your health as well if they're tracking your steps and maybe your blood oxygen levels. So it's a little bit strange that these are the people who are preventing one set of people, preventing another set of people from accessing the data. Now, there's these questions that we have to ask. So first is, what is the legitimacy of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, or now I guess say business executives, making decisions that will affect the sovereign countries and the leaders who feel that they want to be empowered to do all they can. And what are the interests of the organizations involved? I mean, obviously, if you're the leader of a country like Germany, your interest is in public health and public safety. That's your job. If you're a technology company, you've got other interests. Adherence to the rules. These companies are ones that are constantly under regulatory scrutiny for violating antitrust law and other laws. Yet, countries themselves are constantly failing to adhere to their own rules as well, and it's hard to punish the sovereign. And then there's a strange question of, are we being hostage to the edge case? Should citizens of Britain, France, and Germany have a dumbed down exposure notification app rather than a robust track and trace app because these developers at Apple and Google were wary of Vladimir Putin? These are questions that we've not debated. There's even no forum to have that debate, and hence I'm bringing it today. And of course, throughout all of these questions and this entire debate, we're forgetting the most critical element. We've strayed from it. It's a pandemic. People are dying, and we've got to do everything we can to prevent other people from getting ill. And track and trace is a vital tool. Technology in general is a vital tool to enable that, to make sure we can actually save lives and prevent infections. At its core, it is a debate between individual privacy and public health. And if you look at how the exposure notification apps have been deployed, you got to scratch your head and say, hey, surely society could have done better, right? In Germany, there's been 18 million downloads. In France, there's only been 2.4 million, and a quarter of those people uninstalled it because the app didn't work so well. By early September, there was only 200 notifications on the app that had been downloaded by 2.5 million people. And in Britain, it's even worse. The app just launched on the 24th of September. That's a few days before, it's actually a day before I'm giving this presentation. And you would think that they could have organized it a little bit better. Now, anarchy in the UK, the British system is a great way of thinking about the problems that you would face and how a lot of different interests collide. The government should have done better. There's no excuse. Initially, they didn't say how long they were going to hold the data. Then when they finally did disclose it, they announced that it was going to be 20 years. That seems weird. I mean, this is data they're now not collecting, but this is what they initially wanted to do with the first version last spring of a track and trace app. That just seems peculiar that you would need it for that long. And if you do, and I think actually maybe that is a reasonable thing, you have to just justify to the public why you need it for 20 years. What is the benefit? What's the value? How are you going to protect it? Again, there may very well be legitimate reasons. I sort of think there probably are. But if you're not even able to announce it, and you want to fail to disclose it, well, shame on you. Like, ça va pas. We're not going to allow that as citizens. The activists have been no better. One group of activists, privacy activists, sued the government for what they called recklessness, because there was no risk assessment that in compliance with the GDPR rules, that if you're going to have a track and trace app, you need a risk assessment around what it might be. But you can understand why the government didn't have time to do a risk assessment. Again, they're fighting a pandemic and trying to launch the app. So all they needed to do, the government, is to say, hey, we're going to delay it, and here's when we're going to actually produce the risk assessment. And they don't need to be sued or called reckless by privacy advocates. That's just over dramatic. Patients, there's been problems there too. In the 14-day self-isolation that patients who've come down with COVID need to comply with, only 11% have complied. And we only know that because of self-reporting. But you can imagine it might be much lower than that if we had actually the data from a track and trace system, an app that could actually monitor these things. It is monitored, for example, in Taiwan with hefty penalties. There's carrots as well. They actually get something about a little bit less than $100 a day if they have to quarantine just for staying at home. But they get I think 1,000 times that penalty, up to $33,000 or so, which would be about 30,000 pounds, if they actually violate the digital fence that they're sort of put under, that's monitored all the time. The contacts in Britain and in Europe, typically the contacts will be announced at 3 to 4 contacts if you have COVID and you're contacted by a contact tracing person on the telephone. In Taiwan, that's 15 to 20 contacts that are shared. Now, I don't think it's because the people in Europe want to be reticent in terms of what they're sharing. I mean, the people are patients and they want to protect the people who they've been in touch with. Maybe they're just not so aware of it, but whatever the reason, it does show that if you had an app, that part of the problems would go away because you'd be able to do this automatedly. And the media, don't even get me started. So at the core of this problem is a matter of trust and institutions. And why I'm bringing it up today is technology. And if we think about those 3 elements that I brought out earlier about legitimacy and interest and adherence to the rules, you have to imagine there's got to be a way that we can have a public-private partnership, that there could be stewardship and a custodianship around the data and severe penalties, and that together these 3 features answer the concerns that we have. It gets down to capabilities. We need competency, and the state has shown that, typically in the military, there's often competency there, very meritocratic structure. We need transparency, and judiciary is typically the agent in the government that is probably the most transparent. Not only are there rulings, but those rulings have to be reasoned, and there's a whole chain of review of the reasoning and the ruling together. Justice is done and seen to be done. It's a principle of Western jurisprudence. Accountability, that's tougher. Who holds the sovereign to account? Honestly, it's not clear. And we're seeing the fragile nature of our democracies the more that we see populism in places where we didn't expect it, whether it's Hungary or Turkey, whether it's Britain or whether it's America. So we need to have this societal conversation, and we need to talk about, and I wanted to use this moment to launch this conversation, a very rigorous conversation on, can we trust the technology if we can't trust the institutions that have to deploy the technology, right? It's not good enough to have homomorphic encryption if we don't think it's implemented well, if the random number generator is not so random because it suits someone's interest that it's not. If only the geeks understand the technology, how do we expect the public to trust it? The public's not even trusting the scientists who say wear a mask. How would they willingly allow all of these features of data that could be done from the cell phone if they don't think the state is going to have a bounded use of it that will preserve their freedom and their lives? Ultimately, it gets down to, can we use the data for public health and protect privacy at the same time? Can we have it both ways? I don't even know how we can actually move forward in this. Where is the forum for this debate? Who are the people who need to be around the table? But what is clear is that we need to have this conversation as if our life depended on it, because it probably does. Thank you. I hope this has been useful to start a fire, to start a conversation, and to get us all thinking about the ways in which we need to use data to be responsible and to think about how to interact in a world in which COVID is a very real part of our life. And we need to actually do all that we can to protect ourselves and our communities. I look forward to talking more about this. Thank you.